The year was 37 AD, and the streets of Rome erupted in celebration as news spread like wildfire through the empire. The tyrant Tiberius was dead, and ascending to the purple throne was a young prince beloved by all. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known affectionately as Caligula, represented hope after decades of paranoid rule. Citizens danced in the forums, soldiers raised their cups in triumph, and senators breathed sighs of relief. Finally, they believed, Rome would have an emperor worthy of its glory. They had no idea they were celebrating the rise of history's most sexually depraved monster. What began as a golden dawn would transform into 4 years of terror so complete, so sexually perverse, that historians would struggle for centuries to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. This wasn't merely madness or simple cruelty. This was something far more sinister, a calculated campaign of sexual violence that would redefine the very boundaries of human evil. Today, we dive into the twisted mind of an emperor who turned the Roman Empire into his personal laboratory of sexual terror. But before we begin, I must warn you, what we're about to explore contains disturbing accounts of sexual violence, psychological torture, and depravity that may shock even those familiar with ancient history's darkest chapters. The man who would become Rome's most feared sexual predator wasn't born a monster. Like many tyrants, Caligula's path to depravity began in childhood trauma that would shape every twisted decision of his reign. Born into the imperial family in 12 AD, young Gaius spent his earliest years not in marble palaces, but in military camps along the Germanic frontier, where violence was the daily currency and human father Germanicus' command life held little value. His Rome's legions with, but the distinction boy who would become Caligula absorbed lessons far different from military strategy. Surrounded by hardened soldiers who celebrated brutality, who found entertainment in the suffering of enemies, the developing mind of little Gaius normalized behaviors that should have horrified any civilized person. When the troops nicknamed him Caligula for the tiny military boots they crafted for him, they thought they were honoring a future leader. Instead, they were nurturing something that would eventually devour the empire they served. The first catastrophic blow came when Caligula was only 6 years old. His beloved father Germanicus died mysteriously in Syria, possibly poisoned by political enemies. The boy watched his mother Agrippina transform from grieving widow into a paranoid survivor, seeing assassins behind every corner and teaching her son that trust was weakness and manipulation was survival. But the true education in evil began when teenage Caligula was brought to live with his great-uncle Emperor Tiberius on the island of Capri. What he found there would corrupt his developing sexuality in ways that would later terrorize an empire. Capri, in the early 30s AD, wasn't the paradise it appeared to visiting dignitaries. Behind closed doors, it had become a laboratory of sexual experimentation where Rome's emperor indulged appetites that would shock even the most jaded Roman citizen. Ancient historians whisper of Tiberius's swimming pools, where young boys were trained for the emperor's pleasure like performing dolphins. They describe chambers designed specifically for acts so depraved that even hardened Romans refused to speak of them directly. In this environment of systematic sexual abuse, teenage Caligula didn't break like a typical victim. Instead, he studied, he learned, he catalogued every manipulation of psychological technique, every method of using sexual power to inspire terror. What made Caligula truly dangerous wasn't that he suffered abuse, but how he internalized those lessons. While other victims might have been traumatized into submission, Caligula absorbed the mechanics of sexual domination with the clinical detachment of a scholar. He learned that the ultimate power wasn't just physical control, but psychological destruction. He discovered that the most exquisite pleasure came not from simple gratification, but from watching victims destroy themselves through complicity in their own degradation. Suetonius tells us that even as a teenager, Caligula possessed an almost supernatural ability to hide his thoughts. Behind a mask of charm, Tiberius never suspected that his young heir was methodically studying every cruel innovation, every psychological technique, every method of using sexuality as a weapon of terror. When the old emperor finally died in 37 AD, possibly with Caligula's assistance, the 18-year-old who inherited the throne had received the most comprehensive education in sexual sadism that the ancient world could provide. The Roman people, desperate for relief from Tiberius's paranoid final years, welcomed their new emperor with unprecedented celebration. They saw a young, handsome prince who represented the future. What they didn't realize was that they had just crowned a predator whose understanding of sexual power would soon transform their civilization into a nightmare beyond their darkest imaginings. The early months of Caligula's reign seemed to justify the people's hope. He released political prisoners, granted bonuses to the military, and hosted spectacular games that reminded Romans of their empire's glory. But those closest to the palace began noticing disturbing signs. Servants whispered about strange requests that made no sense. Guards reported orders that seemed designed more to humiliate than to serve any practical purpose. Most ominously, the emperor's eyes held depths that seemed far older and infinitely more dangerous than his 19 years should have allowed. The first victims were the wives and daughters of Rome's elite. But this wasn't random lust. Each target was chosen with calculated precision to maximize psychological impact. Caligula understood that true power wasn't just taking what he wanted, but forcing his victims to participate willingly in their own destruction. He would publicly announce his intention to bed a senator's wife, then watch with clinical fascination as the husband was forced to smile and nod approval while dying inside from shame and rage. These weren't mere sexual encounters. They were psychological experiments conducted by a ruler who had learned to find pleasure not in human connection, but in human annihilation. Women who emerged from private audiences with the emperor weren't just physically violated, they were psychologically shattered in ways that suggested systematic torture disguised as imperial favor. But perhaps most disturbing was how quickly Roman society began to adapt to these horrors. What initially shocked witnesses into stunned silence gradually became normalized as the price of imperial favor. Caligula was systematically corrupting the moral sensibilities of an entire civilization, training Rome's elite to accept and even facilitate sexual violence as a routine aspect of political life. The transformation from beloved young emperor to sexual monster had taken less than a year, but this was only the beginning. What started as individual acts of sexual predation would soon evolve into something far more systematic and infinitely more terrifying. Caligula had learned the fundamentals of sexual terror. Now he was ready to apply those lessons on an unprecedented scale, turning the entire Roman Empire into his personal laboratory of depravity. The boy who had survived among monsters was about to show Rome what he had truly learned from his education in evil. The transformation began in earnest during 38 AD, when Caligula unveiled what would become his most infamous innovation: the systematic sexual humiliation of Rome's most sacred institution, the imperial family itself. His three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, represented everything noble about the Julian bloodline. To the Roman people, they embodied grace, intelligence, and the promise of dynastic continuity. To their brother, they represented something far more sinister: perfect subjects for his evolving experiments in sexual domination. What Caligula orchestrated wasn't merely incest, a crime that, while shocking, had precedent in royal families throughout history. This was the weaponization of familial bonds for sexual gratification, conducted with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher studying the behavior of laboratory specimens. He redesigned the imperial family quarters, removing walls and barriers to create interconnected spaces where privacy became impossible and shame became a shared experience. But here's where Caligula's true genius for psychological terror revealed itself. He simultaneously elevated his sisters to divine status, forcing the Roman people to worship them as goddesses, while privately subjecting them to degradations that would have horrified the lowest prostitute in the Surbera. This wasn't contradiction, it was calculated psychological warfare designed to corrupt the very concepts of sacred and profane that held Roman society together. Drusilla, the most beautiful of his sisters, bore. Ancient sources describe a relationship that transcended normal categories of abuse, entering territories that challenged contemporary understanding of human depravity. Caligula claimed their union was mystically necessary for the empire's spiritual health, forcing palace priests to sanctify what were essentially ritualized sexual assaults disguised as religious ceremonies. The emperor's innovations in family destruction went far beyond simple physical abuse. He systematically destroyed the bonds of trust and affection between his sisters, forcing them to witness each other's humiliation while being unable to offer comfort or support. This wasn't random cruelty. It was the deliberate fracturing of human connections to ensure his victims remained isolated and dependent on his twisted version of Agrippina the Younger, futurection. Aegiar, mother of Nero, responde. Rather than breaking differently than her sisters under the psychological pressure, she learned to manipulate the situation, using her brother's obsession to gain political influence while internally calculating her revenge. Her survival strategy would later inform her own approach to imperial power, creating a cycle of sexual manipulation that would plague the Julian line for generations. The Roman Senate found itself trapped in an impossible position. They were legally required to participate in religious ceremonies, honoring the emperor's sisters as goddesses, while knowing these same women were victims of systematic sexual abuse. Senators had to deliver speeches praising Drusilla's divine purity, while understanding she was being psychologically destroyed by her own brother behind palace doors. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, possibly from the physical and psychological toll of sustained abuse, Caligula's reaction revealed the true depth of his psychological disturbance. He declared official periods of mourning that resembled a lover's grief more than brotherly sorrow, made it treason to show insufficient sadness at her passing, and began desperately seeking women who resembled her to serve as sexual substitutes. But these replacements only highlighted what he had lost: years of careful psychological conditioning that couldn't be replicated with new victims. His surviving sisters found themselves trapped in an escalating nightmare as Caligula's sexual attention focused more intensely on them, now seasoned with the additional perversion of forcing them to participate in memorial rituals for their dead sister that were barely disguised sexual reenactments. The destruction of the imperial family had effects that rippled throughout Roman civilization. Noble families began living in terror that their own daughters might be chosen as imperial concubines, while the moral authority of the ruling house collapsed under the weight of publicly acknowledged corruption. Marriage became a source of fear rather than joy, as any union that produced beautiful daughters risked imperial attention. By 39 AD, Caligula had successfully transformed incest from a private shame into a public institution, creating a template for imperial sexual behavior that would haunt Rome for decades. But his appetite for innovation was far from satisfied. The systematic sexual terrorization of his own family had merely been practiced for something far more ambitious: the complete sexual subjugation of the Roman Empire itself. The next phase of his reign would make his treatment of his sisters seem almost merciful by comparison. Caligula had perfected his techniques on willing subjects who couldn't resist. Now he was ready to test those methods on an entire civilization that had no choice but to submit to his will. The emperor began expanding his sexual experiments beyond the palace walls, transforming Rome's most sacred institutions into theatres of degradation. The gladiatorial games, traditionally celebrations of martial valor and Roman virtue, became stages for sexual humiliation designed to demonstrate that no family, regardless of wealth or status, possessed anything he couldn't claim and corrupt for his amusement. These weren't random acts of imperial excess. Every selection, every public humiliation, every private torture was calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact, not just on the immediate victims, but on Roman society as a whole. Caligula was conducting a massive experiment in social engineering, studying how sexual terror could be used to reshape an entire civilization's understanding of power, dignity, and human worth. The games began traditionally enough, with professional gladiators displaying skill and courage in honorable combat. But then came Caligula's innovations. Captured enemies' wives and daughters, forced to perform degrading acts as intermission entertainment, while their families were compelled to watch from the stands. The emperor's attention wasn't on the spectacle itself, but on the faces of the victims' relatives in the crowd, studying their expressions with the clinical detachment of a researcher documenting the results experiment. The most psych of a particularly fascinating and logically devastating innovation was forcing Roman nobility to participate directly in their own family's destruction. Senators received commands to send their wives and daughters to serve as attendants in the games, knowing this service would involve sexual acts performed for the entertainment of hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens. Refusal meant not just death, but the guarantee that every female member of their family would suffer far worse fates. Caligula established specialized training facilities beneath the Circus Maximus, where captured enemies and condemned criminals were taught not combat skills, but techniques designed to maximize psychological trauma during public exhibitions. These weren't gladiator schools in any traditional sense. They were academies of sexual torture, staffed by the empire's most inventive sadists who competed to develop new methods of public humiliation that would leave lasting scars on both victims and witnesses. The emperor's most terrifying innovation was his practice of randomly selecting audience members during the games to participate in impromptu sexual exhibitions. A single gesture from the imperial box could transform a respectable Roman matron into an unwilling performer in front of her own children, friends, and entire social circle. These selections weren't random despite appearances. Caligula had developed an intricate intelligence network that tracked the personal lives, political connections, and psychological vulnerabilities of every prominent Roman family. Each public humiliation was precisely targeted to achieve maximum devastation, not just for the immediate victim, but for their entire social network. The intelligence system Caligula created was perhaps more sophisticated than any surveillance apparatus the ancient world had ever seen. Palace slaves were trained to function as psychological profilers, studying the behavior patterns of senators' wives during social gatherings, identifying which women might break quickly under pressure and which would require more elaborate methods of psychological destruction. These assessments were compiled into detailed reports that read like military intelligence briefings, complete with recommendations for optimal methods of sexual coercion based on each target's specific emotional vulnerabilities. What made this system particularly insidious was how it corrupted Rome's traditional social bonds. Friendship became dangerous because close associates might report private conversations to imperial agents. Marriage became a liability because spouses could be used as leverage against political. Even parent-child relationships were poisoned as lived in constant fear that their loved ones might be selected for imperial attention. The emperor's network extended far beyond Rome itself, reaching into every corner of the empire where Roman citizens might believe themselves safe from imperial scrutiny. Provincial governors received detailed instructions on identifying suitable candidates for transportation to the capital, with quotas based on regional population and assessments of local beauty standards. What had begun as random imperial excess was evolving into systematic sexual colonization of the entire Roman world. Caligula's psychological experiments revealed disturbing truths about human nature that he exploited with scientific precision. He discovered that people would adapt to almost any level of degradation if it was introduced gradually and accompanied by the promise of survival. Roman nobles who would have died their families allowing before to be dishonored found themselves actively facilitating that dishonor when the alternative was complete annihilation. The emperor developed a sophisticated understanding of what helplessness, by modern psychology, would recognize as learning, creating situations where resistance was not just futile but counterproductive. He trained entire social classes to accept sexual victimization as inevitable. The most broken victims often became his most enthusiastic collaborators, competing to offer their own family members for imperial attention in hopes of gaining favor or simply avoiding worse fates. But Caligula's true genius lay in his ability to make complicity feel like choice. He rarely issued direct commands for sexual submission. Instead, he created circumstances where refusal was technically possible but practically suicidal. A senator might be invited to volunteer his daughter for temple service, knowing full well what that service entailed, but maintaining the fiction that he was making a religious dedication rather than offering his child for sexual abuse. These psychological manipulations extended to the victims themselves. Women selected for imperial attention were treated with elaborate ceremony and granted temporary status as divine consorts. They received expensive gifts, luxurious quarters, and public recognition that their families desperately needed for political survival. The emperor understood that victims who could be made to feel grateful for their abuse were far more psychologically destroyed than those who maintained clear recognition of their victimization. The corruption spread through Roman society like a psychological plague. Families began preemptively offering daughters to the emperor as insurance against future persecution. Mothers taught their children that sexual submission to imperial power was a form of patriotic duty. Marriage contracts began, including clauses acknowledging potential imperial claims on wives and daughters. The entire social fabric of Roman civilization was being rewoven around the normalization of sexual terror. By 40 AD, Caligula had successfully transformed sexual violence from an aberrant crime into an accepted aspect of imperial governance. Provincial officials competed to demonstrate their loyalty by facilitating access to local populations. Military commanders began evaluating conquered territories based on the sexual attractiveness of their inhabitants rather than strategic value. The Roman Empire itself was becoming a vast apparatus for the systematic sexual exploitation of its own people. The emperor's innovations in mass sexual manipulation reached their peak during his infamous floating bridge across the Bay of Naples. What appeared to be an extravagant engineering project designed to allow Caligula to ride across the water wearing Alexander's breastplate was actually something far more sinister. The bridge served as a platform for public sexual exhibitions visible from the shorelines, where thousands of Roman citizens were forced to witness elaborate ceremonies that combined religious ritual with organized sexual abuse. These bridge spectacles weren't random displays of imperial excess. They were carefully choreographed psychological operations designed to demonstrate that geography itself provided no protection from imperial sexual authority. The message was clear. Caligula's power extended across land, sea, and sky. No distance was too great, no hiding place too remote, no sanctuary too sacred to prevent the emperor from claiming what he desired. The floating bridge ceremonies also served as recruiting grounds for Caligula's expanding network of sexual collaborators. Witnesses who showed appropriate enthusiasm for the spectacles were identified and cultivated as potential agents. Those who displayed disgust or horror found themselves selected for more personal attention. The emperor had learned to read facial expressions and body language with the expertise of a professional interrogator, identifying psychological types that could be exploited for specific purposes within his growing apparatus of sexual terror. What made these bridge ceremonies particularly psychologically devastating was their combination of religious symbolism with sexual degradation. Caligula dressed participating victims in sacred garments associated with various goddesses, forcing observers to witness the simultaneous worship and violation of their most fundamental religious beliefs. This wasn't mere blasphemy, It was the systematic destruction of the spiritual foundations that gave meaning to Roman life. The emperor's understanding of mass psychology had evolved far beyond simple intimidation. He realized that humans could be trained to find pleasure in witnessing suffering if that suffering was properly contextualized and gradually normalized. The bridge ceremonies included elements designed to make audience participation feel celebratory rather than coercive. Music, wine, and food were provided. Applause was expected at specific moments. Failure to show sufficient enthusiasm was noted and remembered. By the end of 40 AD, Caligula had created a sexual surveillance state that extended throughout the known world. Every Roman citizen lived with the understanding that their bodies, their families, and their most intimate relationships existed at imperial pleasure. The emperor had successfully weaponized sexuality itself, transforming it from a source of human connection and joy into an instrument of political control and psychological domination that would leave scars on Roman civilization for generations to come. The systematic nature of this sexual terror was perhaps its most frightening aspect. This wasn't the random violence of a madman, but the calculated implementation of a comprehensive program designed to remake human society according to the twisted vision of a ruler who had learned to find ultimate pleasure in the complete psychological destruction of his own people. The depths of Caligula's sexual depravity reached new territories when he turned his attention to the sacred institution of Roman marriage itself. What began as isolated attacks on individual families evolved into a systematic campaign to corrupt the very foundation of Roman domestic life. Marriage, traditionally the cornerstone of Roman virtue and social stability, became another battlefield in the emperor's war against human dignity. Caligula's approach to destroying marriages wasn't crude or obvious. Instead, he developed sophisticated psychological techniques that forced couples to participate in their own destruction while maintaining the appearance of willing collaboration. His methods were so insidious that historians struggle to find adequate language to describe what amounted to the industrialization of marital betrayal. The emperor established what he called marriage tribunals, ostensibly courts designed to resolve domestic disputes, but actually elaborate theaters where he could orchestrate the sexual humiliation of both spouses simultaneously. Couples were required to present their most intimate problems before these tribunals, where Caligula would offer to personally resolve their difficulties through direct intervention. His solutions invariably involved sexual services that destroyed trust between husband and wife, while binding both to him through shared shame. These tribunals served multiple psychological purposes beyond mere entertainment. They allowed Caligula to study the mechanics of marital relationships in detail, identifying specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum emotional damage. He learned that attacking the sexual connection between spouses was far more devastating than simple physical violence, because it corrupted the foundation of trust upon which their entire relationship was built. The emperor's understanding of female psychology proved particularly sophisticated and dangerous. He realized that many Roman women, restricted by law and custom from exercising political power directly, harbored deep resentments about their subordinate status. Caligula offered these women opportunities to reverse traditional gender roles within their marriages, using their husband's political vulnerability to gain temporary authority over men who had previously controlled their lives completely. These role reversals weren't liberation in any meaningful sense. They were carefully orchestrated psychological experiments designed to pit spouses against each other, while making both dependent on imperial favor for their new arrangements. Women who accepted these opportunities found themselves trapped in situations where they had to choose between returning to traditional subordination or continuing to participate in the sexual degradation of their own husbands. So, the marriage tribunals also served as recruitment centers for Caligula's expanding network of domestic spies. Couples who proved willing to betray each other for imperial favor were identified as potential informants within their own social circles. The emperor understood that people who had already crossed fundamental moral boundaries were more likely to cross additional ones when properly motivated. But perhaps most disturbing was how these tribunals normalized the concept of imperial sexual authority within marriage itself. Roman law traditionally protected the sanctity of the marital relationship from outside interference, but Caligula systematically eroded these protections by making couples complicit in their own violation. Husbands found themselves legally authorizing their wives' sexual availability to the emperor. Wives discovered themselves granting permission for their husbands' participation in homosexual activities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The psychological manipulation extended to the children of these destroyed marriages. Caligula understood that witnessing parental degradation created lasting trauma that could be exploited for future political control. Children who saw their parents humiliated and broken were more likely to accept imperial authority as absolute and unchallengeable when they reached adulthood. The emperor's marriage tribunals became so notorious that couples throughout the empire began modifying their behavior preemptively to avoid imperial attention. This self-censorship was exactly what Caligula intended. By creating fear of sexual intervention, he achieved control over intimate relationships throughout Roman society without needing to physically intervene in most cases. The corruption of Roman marriage served as a template for attacking other fundamental social institutions. If the emperor could successfully destroy the trust between husband and wife, he could apply similar techniques to friendships, business partnerships, and even the relationships between parents and children. Sexual terror was proving to be the universal solvent that could dissolve any human bond that might compete with imperial authority. By 41 AD, Roman marriage had been transformed from a sacred covenant into a political arrangement subject to imperial oversight and intervention. Couples lived in constant fear that their most intimate moments might become subjects for public examination and manipulation. The bedroom itself had become contested territory in Caligula's campaign to claim absolute authority over every aspect of human existence. The emperor's innovations in marital destruction were documented in disturbing detail by palace scribes who were required to record the proceedings of marriage tribunals for future reference. These records, fragments of which survived the systematic destruction that followed Caligula's assassination, provide insight into psychological techniques that were centuries ahead of their time in their understanding of human vulnerability. The marriage tribunals represented only one aspect of Caligula's expanding sexual empire. As his confidence grew and his techniques proved successful, he began applying similar methods to religious institutions, military relationships, and even the bonds between masters and slaves. No human connection was considered too sacred or too private to escape imperial sexual authority. The systematic nature of this corruption was perhaps its most frightening characteristic. Caligula wasn't acting on random impulses or uncontrolled desires. He was implementing a comprehensive program designed to remake Roman society according to principles that place sexual submission to imperial power at the center of all human relationships. The emperor's growing network of sexual informants and collaborators created a surveillance system that penetrated into the most private spaces of Roman life. Bedroom activities were monitored and reported. Intimate conversations between spouses were documented and analyzed. Even the sexual practices of slaves were subject to imperial oversight and modification according to techniques developed in the marriage tribunals. This surveillance network served multiple purposes beyond simple intelligence gathering. It created a culture of sexual paranoia where Romans never knew when their most private moments might be observed and judged according to imperial standards. The knowledge that intimate activities were being monitored and evaluated created psychological pressure that made genuine human connection increasingly difficult to maintain. The emperor's understanding of sexual psychology continued to evolve throughout 41 AD as he experimented with increasingly sophisticated methods of manipulation and control. He learned that the most effective techniques weren't those that relied on obvious force or intimidation, but rather those that made victims complicit in their own destruction through carefully structured choices and gradually escalating commitments. The marriage tribunals became laboratories where these techniques could be tested and refined before being applied more broadly throughout Roman society. Each session provided new insights into human psychology that informed future innovations in sexual manipulation and control. The emperor was essentially conducting systematic research into the most effective methods of using sexuality as a weapon of political domination. The psychological damage inflicted on Roman society through the corruption of marriage extended far beyond the immediate victims. Children who witnessed their parents' humiliation carried that trauma into their own adult relationships. Friends and neighbors who observed the destruction of marriages around them learned to guard their own intimate relationships more carefully, creating a general atmosphere of sexual suspicion and fear. The cumulative effect was the gradual erosion of the social bonds that held Roman civilization together. Trust became dangerous. Intimacy became risky. Love itself became a vulnerability that could be exploited by imperial power. The emperor had discovered that by attacking the most fundamental human connections, he could achieve a level of political control that no previous ruler had ever approached. As 41 AD progressed toward its bloody conclusion, Caligula's sexual experiments had created a Roman Empire where human relationships existed only at imperial pleasure. The marriage tribunals had demonstrated that no bond was too sacred, no love too pure, no trust too deep to escape corruption when subjected to sufficiently sophisticated psychological manipulation. The emperor's reign of sexual terror was approaching its climax, but even those plotting his assassination could not have imagined the full extent of the psychological damage he had inflicted on Roman civilization. The techniques he had developed and the systems he had created would survive his death, influencing imperial behavior for generations and leaving permanent scars on the Roman understanding of power, sexuality, and human dignity. The boy who had learned evil on the island of Capri had succeeded in transforming that education into a comprehensive system of sexual domination that reached into every corner of the known world. But his greatest innovation was yet to come, as he prepared to implement the final phase of his plan to remake human civilization according to his own twisted vision of absolute imperial authority. The final phase of Caligula's sexual tyranny emerged in the winter of 41 AD, when the emperor announced his most ambitious project yet, the complete reconstruction of Roman religious practice around his own sexual appetites. What he proposed wasn't merely the addition of new gods to the Roman pantheon, but the systematic replacement of traditional worship with rituals designed to normalize sexual submission as a form of religious devotion. The emperor's theological innovations began with the construction of specialized temples throughout Rome, each dedicated to what he called the sacred mysteries of imperial flesh. These weren't traditional places of worship, but elaborate facilities designed to facilitate mass sexual ceremonies disguised as religious observances. The architecture itself was revolutionary, featuring circular chambers with raised central platforms surrounded by tiered seating that allowed hundreds of worshippers to witness intimate rituals performed by carefully selected victims. Caligula's genius lay in his understanding that Romans would accept almost any practice if it was properly sanctified through religious authority. By positioning himself as the divine intermediary between earthly sexuality and heavenly power, he created a framework where sexual submission became not just politically necessary, but spiritually required. Citizens who might have resisted imperial commands found themselves unable to oppose what appeared to be legitimate religious obligations. The training of temple priestesses revealed the emperor's sophisticated understanding of psychological conditioning. Young women selected for religious service underwent months of preparation, designed not just to teach specific sexual techniques, but to completely reshape their understanding of their own bodies and desires. They were taught that their sexuality belonged not to themselves or future husbands, but to the divine emperor who could channel their physical offerings into spiritual power for the empire's benefit. These priestesses became the core of Caligula's expanding sexual bureaucracy, each responsible for identifying and recruiting additional participants from their home communities. They returned to their families and neighborhoods as missionaries of the new religion, carrying techniques for sexual manipulation that had been perfected in the imperial temples. The emperor had successfully created a self-propagating system of sexual corruption that spread throughout the empire without requiring constant imperial oversight. The religious ceremonies themselves combined elements from various mystery cults with innovations that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and dignity. Participants were required to perform increasingly degrading acts while maintaining the fiction that they were engaging in sacred worship rather than organized sexual abuse. The psychological pressure of this contradiction created lasting mental damage that made victims more compliant with future imperial demands. But Caligula's most devastating innovation was his practice of requiring families to attend these ceremonies together, forcing parents to witness their children's participation while maintaining appropriate religious reverence. The emperor understood that destroying the protective instincts between parents and children was the ultimate method of psychological control. Once these fundamental bonds were corrupted, no resistance to imperial authority remained possible. The emperor's theological system included elaborate justifications for why sexual submission served the empire's spiritual needs. He claimed that individual sexual energy, when properly channeled through imperial authority, could be transformed into divine power that protected Rome from foreign enemies and ensured agricultural abundance. These explanations weren't random superstitions, but carefully crafted propaganda designed to give intellectual cover to practices that would otherwise be recognized as systematic abuse. The recruitment of children for temple service represented perhaps the most horrific aspect of Caligula's religious innovations. Families throughout the empire received invitations to dedicate their offspring to divine service, with the understanding that refusal would result in immediate political consequences. Children as young as 12 were transported to Rome for religious training that was actually systematic preparation for sexual exploitation disguised as spiritual education. The assassination came on January 24th, 41 AD, when Cassius Chaerea's blade finally ended the nightmare that had consumed Rome for 4 years. But the damage was already done. Caligula had successfully demonstrated that human civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined, that the bonds holding society together could be systematically destroyed through the weaponization of sexuality itself. The techniques he pioneered would echo through imperial palaces for generations, leaving scars on the Roman understanding of power that would never fully heal. In just 47 months, one man had proven that absolute authority could corrupt not just the ruler, but the very foundations of human dignity itself.